All right, good evening, everybody. We've come to the special hearing of the Penn Township Zoning Planning Board. We are now called to order. Could the Secretary please call the roll?
Mr. Hensler?
Here.
Mr. DeMark?
Here.
Mr. Rainford has recused himself. Mr. Mahalka?
Here.
Mr. Huber?
Here.
Mrs. Zaka? Here.
At this time, Mr. Sweeney, would you like to take over the meeting to do the proceedings?
When we were here last, looking at the transcript, I think Mr. Hamilton was in the middle of crossing Mr. Garlitz, but my notes reflected Mr. Garlitz couldn't be with us tonight. So I wanted to reflect the record that Mr. Hamilton will still have the opportunity with Mr. Garlitz, so he can be sure he's here next week.
That's correct.
Okay. And then we've got 2 reports for Protect PT witnesses tonight. That's where we're starting.
We have several additional witnesses
Okay.
that this condo will be handling.
Then that's where we'll start.
We would call Mr. Tom Walsh. Please raise your right hand. You solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give here today in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God. Could you please state your full name?
Harry Thomas Walsh.
Mr. Walsh, I would just direct your attention to your CV, which is in the board's binder at Exhibit 3. If you could briefly tell us your educational background.
I have a bachelor's degree in geology from Penn University. I have a master's degree in hydrogeology from the University of Toronto.
And what is your current job, and if you could just briefly tell us your job experience since getting your degrees?
I'm currently a principal hydrogeologist with Civil and Environmental Consultants. I've been working there since graduate school for 27 years. I conduct hydrogeologic studies, investigations, ground contamination investigations, outdoor testing.
Do you have any voir dire, Mr. Hamilton? I would at this point offer Mr. Walsh as an expert in hydrogeology.
No, thank you.
Mr. Walsh, did I ask you to provide an expert report in this matter?
Yes.
And for the board's benefit, that report is in your binder as Exhibit 1N. Did I ask you to review ordinance language and do a hydrogeologic study consistent with that language?
Yes.
Can you tell the board what you did and what methodology you used? And why don't you go ahead and hold this?
So according to the ordinance, as we understood, we were to do a hydrogeologic study, identify potential pathways that a spill or a release of fluids might follow from the proposed gas pad site. We did this very similar to the previous report that we did for the guide pad. We took a look at the site topography, where the site was in the geologic section, the local drainage patterns. We visited the site and walked it. And then we looked at the proposed engineering controls and the proposed construction drawings. And we looked at the best management practices and the proposed ENS controls to determine where a surface release might flow if it was released from the pad. And then, as we did with the previous report, our assumption was that it was essentially an infinite source of water. In other words, we were tasked with determining all the potential pathways. So to do that, we had to look at anything that could potentially happen. So looking at all the BMPs and all the containment structures, we assumed that they would all fail, and that there would essentially be an infinite source of water. And where would that water go? So essentially, it's a worst case scenario. So we did that for surface water. So we determined that there was enough water that it would flow off the pad into the ENS containment areas, flow, be too much for that to handle, and flow out of there, and then where it would eventually end up.
And perhaps by directing the board to the relevant figures, can you walk them through the pathway, if you will, under that worst-case scenario where liquids or waters that might spill would flow?
Sure. Maybe a good place to start would be figure 2, which is from the ESCG2 application, and it shows some of the ENS controls. And the reason I started with this is it's a little bit different than the guide pad. There are some, in addition to the berm around the pad, and also the infiltration basin in the south, as there was in the previous one. There's also numerous berms to the west of the road.
We need to get some direction on where that map is.
Sure.
Reminder.
It should be a figure to Exhibit 1N.
It's the black and white one. That's page 20.
Page 20.
You're on the right page. Turn back. That's figure number 2 in the lower right corner of the graph.
Yeah.
That should be it right there.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, so in addition to the berm around the pad and the infiltration basin to the south, which, as you look at your figure, is on the right, there are also numerous berms to the west of the road, which is towards you, that are meant to intercept surface water as well. So that's a little different than we saw before. So that's kind of the ENS controls. And if you flip to figure 5, so the area shaded in blue would be the potential locations where surface water might flow. So obviously, if there was a release of an infinite amount of hypothetical fluid, obviously it would inundate the well pad itself. It would go to the infiltration basin, which is in your figure just to the right. There's also an overflow, so if there was so much fluid that it would overflow that basin, it would flow down that channel toward the road. If there was an infinite amount of water that spilled to the east of the access road, it would flow under some culverts into the road and be caught by those berms on the hillside. If there was so much water that it inundated those berms, it would overflow those berms and it would flow down the hill and toward the road, at which point there were some culverts along the road. It would discharge through the culverts and to the shore. That's surface water. The next figure is potential groundwater impacts. So groundwater is a little bit different.
Just to orient everybody, you're now referring to figure 6.
Figure 6, that's correct. So this is a potential groundwater impact. Now, for groundwater, it's a little bit different. Groundwater has to, it's a percentage of surface water that infiltrates into the ground. It doesn't run off. So of all that water, a percentage of it is going to run off, a percentage of it is going to infiltrate. And then once it gets into the shallow groundwater zone, where it's going to go. Groundwater flow is usually a subdued expression of surface topography, so we can usually look at the surface topography and get a decent indication of where groundwater might flow. So in this case, it's flowing essentially downslope to the west, a little bit to the north, and a little bit to the south. And then if you see there's that kind of channel that flows off to the east, there is a surface depression in there that we think is probably has some effect on groundwater flow. So it's a little bit of it's going to deflect to the east. So this location is very similar to the Gaia pad in as much as it's bounded on two sides by streams, which act as shallow groundwater interceptors. So it's kind of bounded within that area. So that's kind of the discharge points on each side.
And in connection with the METIS hydrogeologic evaluation, did you look at water wells and the risk to water wells from any groundwater spills?
So the well figure is a couple back. It is shown on figure 4. So these are the wells that were identified from 2 sources, the DCNR well database and Huntley's ongoing well survey. So
I'm sorry, you said these are the wells. Can you just tell them how the wells are depicted on figure 4?
So the wells that are purple triangles are in the DCNR water well database. And the wells that are the yellow triangles are the known domestic wells based on the ongoing Huntley pre-drill survey. So you kind of got to take a look at these in conjunction, groundwater and the wells together. The majority of these wells are west of the stream, so they're beyond area that would be influenced by even a hypothetical spill. There are a couple wells. There's one well to the south that is within the watershed of the pad, but it's far south of that we thought that the potential impacts from that would be very low.
Have all of the conclusions and opinions that you came to, both in your report and in your testimony here tonight, been within a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes.
Thank you.
Mr. Hamilton?
Mr. Walsh, are you an expert in unconventional gas development operations or drilling?
No.
Are you an expert in cementing or casing of unconventional natural gas wells?
No.
Mr. Walsh, did you sign this report?
No, it was not signed.
Were you the author of this report?
Yes, I was.
And how do you define the term hydrogeologic in the context of your report?
Hydrogeologic is the interaction of groundwater within the subsurface.
And what about the terms fluids and releases?
I'm not sure I...
So in the context of your report, you note that we're addressing that phrase in the ordinance, fluids and releases. How are you defining that?
So it would be an uncontrolled release from the well pad site of any controlled fluid.
So in the context of your report, is it fair to say it's limited to surface spills?
Yes.
You mentioned in your direct exam that Huntley is still undertaking their water well survey, is that correct?
They were at the time that we authored this report. I'm not sure where they are right now.
So to your knowledge, there may be unidentified water wells in the vicinity of this well pad?
There may.
Mr. Walsh, turning to figure 2 of your report. In the top kind of right-hand corner there's just off the well pad, there's labeled a discharge trench. Can you describe that? What does that mean?
Infiltration basin.
Right, so just next to the left of the infiltration basin, there's kind of a darker rectangle there.
This right here?
Yeah, it's identified. Can you just describe what is the function of discharge trench?
So this is not my drawing. This is the engineer's drawing, the ZHB2. As I understand it, that is the trench that accepts the water. There's a pipe that leads from the pad to the infiltration basin, and that kind of dissipates the water and lets it flow evenly over the infiltration basin. As I understand it, again, this is not my drawing.
And the infiltration basin, the purpose of that is to have stormwater infiltrate into the ground to the groundwater. Is that correct?
It's actually twofold. And again, this is civil engineering, I'm not a civil engineer, but it's to store water until it can dissipate in the ground. Yes.
And is it the intent that it dissipates into the ground at that infiltration basin?
Yes, that's correct.
Your report in section 2.3.3, you identified two distinct hydrogeologic settings, the lower setting, the deeper zone and the shallower zone. Have you identified where those are for this Metis well site?
Not specifically because we haven't drilled any monitoring wells here. The only way to really know that for certain is to drill monitoring wells and measure the water level. We're basing it on our experience drilling in these areas. You know, I can always usually tell within 10, 15 feet where we're probably going to get water out. So,
But you haven't drilled wells to confirm that in this case?
no, we haven't.
And your report in section 7 kind of identifies pathways for spills at the access road and on the well pad, is that correct?
That's correct.
And for a spill that occurs on the access road, where does that ultimately discharge to?
It also ultimately ends up in the stream to the west.
And that stream is identified in your report.
It is.
What about a spill on the surface of the well pad itself? Where does that ultimately discharge to?
Ultimately the same receiving water.
You also note that overland flow outside of the engineered stormwater controls would follow topography. In what situation would an overland flow outside of the stormwater controls occur?
That would have to be some type of, I guess, uncontrolled spill outside an operation area. I guess, you know, if there was a runaway truck that was off the path or somewhere off the road, it's very unlikely to happen, but it would have to be outside of the areas that were intended for operations.
So that's a possibility, and you note in your report that it would follow topography.
That's correct.
In section 8 of your report, I believe you conclude that the potential for a release to reach those surface waters, the tributaries identified, and the potential for that to pose an environmental concern is based on dependent on the chemicals and the volume that's ultimately released. Is that correct?
And the weather.
And the weather. Thank you. Have you evaluated those factors to determine the environmental impact of such a release at the Metis well site?
No, we have not. As I understand, that was not what the purpose of this report was. We were just to identify potential pathways.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Does the board have any questions for Mr. Walsh?
Mr. Walsh, on drawings 4 and 6, there are wetlands A and B identified. And these are small, so it's a little hard to see. But what's the source of the water for the wetlands? Is it the same groundwater? Or is it coming from a different direction?
So there's usually two potential sources for wetlands. It could be what we call transient water, which is water from precipitation that is infiltrating, that gets held up in either depression or impermeable soils. That's one possibility. The second possibility is it could be a surface expression of groundwater. So that shallow groundwater zone that we talked about, that the groundwater can be flowing into the fresh rock. It might come to an impermeable layer and be deflected because the bedding plate is nearly horizontal, be deflected to the ground surface and pop out along the hillside. So it could be either one of those two factors.
Well, it looks like from the map that these wetlands are right along the stream channel.
Yeah, that's correct.
for my edification, what's depicted in Figure 5 is what you described to us as the ultimate worst case scenario, catastrophic failure to release the largest potential quantity of water. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So, to get to the stream, if we don't have that kind of release of water, can you give us an idea of the chance of that, of a release actually reaching the tributary of the stream?
It would be minute. A whole cascade of improbable things would have to happen. You'd have to have a release, first of all. There's secondary containment around each structure, so it would have to be beyond the secondary containment of the structure. It would have to be released into the pad, and at which point they would close the valve. There's a valve at the corner of the well pad to keep flow from going from the pad to the infiltration burn, and then respond and remove that fluid. So it would have to go beyond that, so much that they could not remove it, and it would inundate the pad, and then it would have to flow to the infiltration basin and have enough water to inundate that. So from my review of the ESCGP2 application, they designed these for a certain storm event, which corresponds to a volume of water over a period of time. And so they design enough volume within these retention areas to handle the amount of water. And the amount of water that this is designed for is upwards of 900,000 gallons that it can store for a certain period of time. So it'd have to be a release, and all those things would have to happen, and they would have to be in excess of that design volume that this can handle in a given time for it actually happen. So when I tell you it's worst case, it's totally hypothetical worst case, because we're trying to identify all potential pathways.
And for other fluids that are stored on the pad in smaller quantities than what you're talking about, I guess, is the fresh water coming on for the fracking and that kind of thing, right? When you're talking about turning the valve.
So that valve is at the corner of the pad, and when most of these controls are designed for stormwater. When you come on this pad, it's got to go somewhere. There's a drain around the inside of the pad, inside the berm, that collects the water and sends it to the infiltration basin. So it's all meant to handle stormwater, it's not meant to handle releases. If there were a release, they have the ability to close that pipe that goes from the pad to the infiltration basin, because you don't want a release fluid, that's a control fluid, to make it to there. So they would turn that valve off until they did the cleanup on the pad site, and then once it was cleaned up, they would open it back up again to handle stormwater.
But a release of something other than stormwater that's stored on the pad would have to progress through all these stages of the catastrophic event to eventually get to the stream. So
Yeah, and at that kind of volume that we're talking about, which is, none of those kind of volumes happen on the pad site areas.
anybody else have any questions for Mr. Walsh?
Mr. Walsh, good. So if I understand correctly, you have not considered any spills occurring from the well bore itself, correct?
In the subsurface,
Subsurface or anything coming up out of the well itself?
but if it came up out of the well as the surface, that's covered in this, but subsurface releases were not part of this investigation.
Was there any investigation for air, if natural gas was coming out of the well, that fluid, as far as how that disperses and part of the air model?
I believe that's a separate report.
Okay. But that wasn't something that your task was covering? And just as a matter of, since we got you as an expert, kind of going back and forth, the term fluid, do you interpret that as liquid and gas or strictly liquid?
Strictly liquid.
All right. Anybody have any questions?
Any follow-up from council?
Just a brief question. Mr. Walsh, you mentioned the unlikely scenario of enough fluid to breach these containment features. That scenario, is that a 100-year storm they identified in the report?
That's what it was designed for, was the 100-year storm, yes.
So if a release occurred while a large storm like that was occurring, that would be the scenario where these contaminants would reach the streams?
I hadn't thought about it that way. I guess if a release happened while the 100-year storm was happening, then, well, first of all, the 100-year storm would be, this design would handle it. You know, it would not, it was in excess of that, if it was the 200-year storm, and there was a release at the same time, then I guess, yeah, there would probably be discharged. But on the other hand, it would be extremely diluted by the huge amount of precipitation from that huge storm event.
May Mr. Walsh be excused?
Sure.
We would next call Jennifer Hoffman. And I'm going to use 2 exhibits with her just to expedite them. We're going to hand them out now.
That's fine. Are they part of the book or are they something? Are they part of the book or are they something?
No, they're not part of the book, but you can put them in. They're pretty much. Knocked everything in.
I have this with
186 and 187.
So we make the radiation monitoring action plan. Yeah, something. Exhibit 6. And the other item is entitled memorandum, and that'll be marked as exhibit 7.
Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you give here today in this matter is the truth and the truth and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Could you please state your full name?
Jennifer Hoffman.
And could you please explain your job title and just very briefly what you do?
Sure, I'm the Vice President of Environmental Health, Safety, and Regulatory at Huntley & Huntley Energy Exploration. So all of the permitting, environmental health and safety programs and policies are under my purview.
We have marked as Exhibit 6 a radiation monitoring action plan. Can you very briefly explain what that plan is and whether it has passed any regulatory muster?
Mr. Sweeney, I object. I don't think this witness has been qualified as an expert to discuss everything that's contained in this radiation plan.
She's not being offered as an expert. This is Huntley & Huntley's radiation monitoring plan, which has been submitted to the PADEP under her auspices, and she's merely going to authenticate the exhibit and indicate that it was prepared for Huntley & Huntley and submitted to and approved by PADEP as a fact company witness.
And it's prepared in the normal course of business and operations of Huntley and Huntley.
That's correct. That is correct. It's a requirement by Pennsylvania DEP.
And it's something that you review before it's submitted
That's correct.
as part of your position.
Yes, sir.
The objections will be overruled.
Going back then to my question, if you can please identify for the record what Exhibit 6 is and how it was submitted to PADEP.
Sure. So Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection requires under Chapter 78A that any operator that's processing fluids or drill cuttings that are generated on its locations are required to develop a radiation action plan to basically provide, serve as a guide and a policy manual to assist our company in maintaining our programs and policies to deal with any kind of naturally occurring radioactive material or denorm on our locations. And it has been submitted to Pennsylvania DEP. It was actually submitted as part of our Poseidon process. Once the action plan is in place and approved by DEP, then it's considered valid at any location that Huntley and Huntley operates.
And you may have already indicated this in connection with Mr. Sweden's questioning, but has the Pennsylvania DEP approved the radiation monitoring action plan, which is Exhibit 6?
Yes.
In connection with the air monitoring that you have agreed to do in connection with the Metaswell pad, will that include air monitoring for hydrogen sulfide?
Yes.
And finally, in response to Mr. Ear's report indicating that there hadn't been, that Mr. Donaldson, when he did his modeling that he testified about in the last hearing, he didn't include modeling for HCl. Did you request that Mr. Donaldson supplement and do the same modeling he had done before, but include HCl?
Yes, we did.
And did he submit such a report to you?
Yes, he did.
I'd like to note an objection again, unless Mr. Donaldson is here to testify about Exhibit 7. I don't think it's appropriate to have Ms. Hoffman testify to this.
Your Honor, if the board requires, Mr. Donaldson, of course, was here to testify before about the modeling he did for all of the other chemicals, but certainly if the board would like to hear from Mr. Donaldson in connection with this modeling, we can have him here at the next hearing next Thursday.
I'm afraid you're going to have to do that because the way we've handled all these hearings and I've explained to many of the citizens is that we can't have you bring in Joe Jones's report. So I think for this to be Exhibit 7, we need to have Mr. Donaldson available to testify about that.
We will do that at the next hearing, Your Honor. With that, I have no further questions for this witness.
This condo, you want to hang on to?
Oh, well, if everyone wants to put it in their binder, and obviously Mr. Ryan has it to examine before next week.
That's fine.
But I understand it won't be admitted until next week when Mr. Donaldson's here.
Is the Exhibit 6, the radiation monitoring action plan, is that different from a radioactive materials handling plan?
So if you go through the radiation monitoring action plan, it actually includes how you implement the plan. It talks about how you handle any potentially radioactive material and includes kind of alert levels and directs our company and any of our consultants on how to manage that activity. Certainly different operations and different companies handle things in different ways, but the requirement is that we develop this to be able to manage any potential issues we see.
So it is a handling plan?
It does, it would tell us how to handle the material and how to take that material off-site.
Okay. Just to clarify, is a separate material handling plan also submitted to the department?
A separate material handling plan is not submitted to the department. It's all inclusive in this plan.
And this radiation monitoring action plan, what are the potential sources of radiation on the Minnesota site?
Sure. So mostly what we're looking at would be drill cuttings, which we would bring to the surface of the well pad. The other potential source, another potential source would be sedimentation in our produced water tanks.
So along with the drill cuttings, the produced water also comes to the surface?
Yeah, the produced water would come to the surface, which would also include some of the drill cuttings within that material, and then it would settle out in the produced water tanks, would then be cleaned out of the produced water tanks on a regular basis and hauled off-site.
And are the drill cuttings separated from the produced water on-site?
So there's actually screening in our separators, and you would have some drill cuttings that come from the formation that settle out as sediment on the bottom of our tanks.
And is that separation process, is that a contained process, or is that open to the air?
So from the produced water, that's a contained process. In our drill cuttings, during the actual drilling process, it's a closed system, but it is open to the air.
So when the drill cuttings and produced water come up, the produced water is sent one direction, and the drill cuttings are sent another direction?
So that happens during two different processes. So during the drilling process is when you get actual drill cuttings that come up. During the producing phase is when you would get produced water. But there is some formation material, so shale, that's actually in the produced water that comes up that settles out in the tanks.
Anybody on the board have any questions?
Yes, this plan, I'm sorry, this plan is actually approved by the ZHB. It isn't one of these plans where you just submit it to them.
That's correct, sir. It's actually approved through something called the OG-71A process. And then once you have that approved by the Pennsylvania DEP, you are required to update it if something would change within your plan. But once it's approved overall by the DEP, then it is accepted at any well site that you're working at. So it will be covered under each for each pad.
Who does the actual monitoring? I see you have an instrument in here. It's not easy to run those instruments. You have to have training in.
That's correct. That's correct. Yeah, so we actually generally have a couple of folks that that are trained to use those instruments, how to calibrate them. Our own EHS internal staff are trained to do that, and we also have outside consultants who are trained to do that.
Thank you.
I just wanted to clarify that you're saying it's not site specific.
That's correct.
That means it's approved for Meadows, it's approved for all.
That's correct.
So what type of levels do you normally see?
That's a great question. So in the plan, our first action level is 10 microrems per hour. At Poseidon, where we have been doing monitoring for the past several months, the highest we've seen is 6 microrems, and that's actually the same as background.
Jake, you explained the typical background levels. You say the typical 6, is that like the normal universal?
So in general, in this area of the United States, because obviously it varies, you generally see between about 5 and about 15 to 20.
Anybody else? First, Berlin, which first action on this, is that something that generates some type of response under this?
That's correct. Some additional monitoring is what it would generate. The first action level, as I mentioned, is 10 micrograms per hour above the background. So for PsyD specifically, now when Metis will have to do some background readings, that would be 16 micrograms per hour. For a kind of a reference, eating a banana is 10 micrograms. I like using the banana.
Where are you looking?
That's all I have.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
We have no further testimony tonight, recognizing a certain individual will be coming back next week.
All right, we'll leave the record open for not to have Mr. Donaldson coming about the memorandum. So, Mr. Hampton, you prepared?
Thank you. This time I'd like to call Laura Dagley to the stand. We actually have 2 expert witnesses this evening, and I think we tried to put their reports in a binder to make it easier, so maybe grab those.
While he's grabbing that, so just as kind of an administrative thing for next week, we have a swimming pool variance that was put in, so we're going to do that first on Thursday. That'll probably take 3 or 4 hours. And so just so you're prepared, probably that'll take till about 8 o'clock. We'll mark the exhibits in the binder. Since we're calling this Dagley first, we mark that as Protect PT Exhibit A. Yeah, she needs to be sworn in.
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give here today is the truth and the truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Dagley, can you please just state and spell your name for the record?
Laura Dagley, Laura Dagley, D as in David.
Ms. Dagley, you were engaged by Protect PT to testify in tonight's Metis hearing as an expert, is that correct?
That's correct.
Ms. Dagley, what is your profession?
I'm a registered nurse.
And is your up-to-date CV attached to the report that was just marked as Protect PT's exhibit?
Yes, it is.
And what educational or professional degrees have you completed?
I have a Bachelor of Science in Nursing.
During nursing school, part of that, what was involved in your education in nursing school?
A lot. Obviously clinicals, but a lot of what I also did was read studies, research studies, and we had to present them and write papers on them, along with learning health assessments and direct patient care.
And on your CV, it notes you were previously employed as a case manager and a visiting nurse, is that correct?
Yeah, when I lived in Harrisburg, I was a case manager for a home health agency.
What was involved in that role? Did you work directly with patients?
Yep, so I had about a caseload of about 30 patients who I managed their care, that involved visiting them in their homes and actually providing care as well as creating their plan and communicating with other disciplines such as physicians and therapists.
Ms. Dagny, how are you currently employed?
I currently have 2 jobs. I am a registered nurse for a hospice agency, similar work to what I did in home health and visiting patients in their homes. And I'm also the medical advocacy coordinator for Physicians for Social Responsibility.
In your position as the medical advocacy coordinator, what types of work do you do?
So we educate and engage the medical community to be involved in speaking out about health effects of environmental concerns such as climate and oil and gas industry. And so a lot of that involves going to conferences, listening to people present these research studies they have done, reading these studies, just a lot of overview of information that I can then digest and pass on to healthcare professionals who are interested in getting involved.
So is it fair to say part of your role is kind of translating that research to other health professionals?
Yes, that's a lot of what I do. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can hear you. Just don't turn your head like too much so I can see.
I don't know who to look at.
You can look at them.
Ms. Dagny, your CV also notes that you're a member of PSNA and ANA. What are those organizations?
ANA is American Nurses Association. It's a nationwide organization, and PSNA is the Pennsylvania State Nursing Association. Both those organizations represent and advocate for nurses and issues that affect them and affect their patient care.
And you're also on the Health Committee Board of PSNA.
Yeah, I'm on the Environmental Health Committee Board for PSNA, and so what we do there is, again, any current environmental health issues that we think may affect nurses and the care that they're going to provide patients. We kind of process the information and discuss it, kind of that filtering to then pass on to nurses and educate them on what's going on.
Okay, at this time, I'd like to offer Ms. Dagny as an expert in public health.
I will have questions, but I can reserve them all. But I would object to this question, to this expert as a nurse being qualified in public health. There's been no foundation laid that she has any training experience or expertise in public health. I would have no problem with her being qualified as an RN, which is what she is.
Respectfully, I think council undervalues the expertise of an RN, and Ms. Dagny has just testified that she has spent time during nursing school reviewing research and health studies, translating those. She's also spent time in her position with PSR in reviewing a lot of this public health research and translating that to other health professionals. She's also a health committee board member of PSNA, where a lot of these types of environmental health issues are addressed as well.
Any conversation or discussion among the board? We can take 5 minutes and go into executive session if you want. If you want to accept her as an expert as a registered nurse in the field of public health, you're free to do that. And as I've explained to you in the past, you're allowed to give whatever weight you feel is appropriate to experts, just as any other witness.
Anybody have any objection that we want to talk about? You want to have a motion?
I think if there's no objection to the record, you can just note for the record that the board's going to accept her as an expert in the area of public health.
I think the board in general, we don't have an issue with taking the witness as an expert.
Ms. Bagley, in preparing your report for this evening, what materials did you review in advance?
I reviewed the Menace well pad application. I reviewed the area maps on geography. I reviewed the series of studies that I referenced in my written testimony by Casey, Stacy, Rabinowitz, Haley. I reviewed the PSR compendium that's also referenced in my written testimony.
And all the opinions that you developed and you're going to talk to the board about this evening, you hold those to a reasonable degree of scientific certainty?
Yes.
And as a registered nurse in your position with PSR, how do you define the role of health professionals like yourself?
Well, I think a lot of nurses and other public or just health professionals in general, we find it frustrating to constantly just be treating the illness of a patient without addressing what's causing the illness. And one of our roles that we feel when caring for a patient is also being an advocate for their health. So health professionals feel that we want to try and prevent illnesses before they occur, and that's an important part of our role.
And as part of that prevention, in your report you mentioned the precautionary principle. Can you describe that for us?
Yes, that's a big part of when you're talking about public health, is that there's the precautionary principle essentially states that if there's any degree of scientific uncertainty on whether or not a certain action is going to cause a negative health outcome, that you err on the side of obviously public safety and health rather than taking the action. So, so in the case where there is conflicting evidence, some may be showing potential harm. You would rather not take that action than risk the harm.
And Dr. Sue, who testified previously, was also employed with PSR. He addressed some of the relevant public health studies related to unconventional gas development. We're not going to repeat his testimony tonight, but without getting into all of those details, can you walk us through some of the public health research that you looked at for your report tonight?
Yeah, so I referenced I think 4 major studies, which are ones that I felt had the strongest significance. 2 of them were looking at pregnant women living near oil and gas activity, and I might just call it fracking, if that's okay, just for ease, shortening the word. But Casey, the study done by Casey, it looked at women living near oil and gas activity or fracking, and found that they had a 40% increased risk of giving birth prematurely, and had a 30% increased risk for having a high-risk pregnancy, and that includes like hypertension during pregnancy, asthma, increased body mass index of pre-pregnancy. Also looked at Stacy, that was talking about study done by Stacy that was looking at women living near well pads. An interesting thing about Stacy is they did look at the density of well pads and found that meaning more well pads within an area that somebody's living, and so if there's increased women living within increased density of well pads, had an increased risk for a lower birth weight. Also looked at Rabinowitz's study, which I know there were some issues I think brought up maybe during Dr. Sue's testimony about it being a study of self-reported symptoms. But I just wanted to make a note that self-reported symptoms are always the first red flag when you're looking at public health issues or public health crisis. So while they may not be as strong as some of the other studies, it's the first study it's the first sign that's going to lead to more studies, and is definitely not taken lightly by the public health community. Especially when there is biological plausibility of the symptoms being reported being caused by the chemicals that are being released from the proposed well pads. So for example, the VOCs like benzene and toluene. In the Rabinowitz study, people were reporting increased dermatological and upper respiratory symptoms, which those chemicals that we know are released from fracking operations have those health effects. And one of the final studies I looked at was, I do not know how to say this researcher's name, Gemalita, but it was a study looked at increased hospitalization rates in Pennsylvania. And again, they're seeing increased rates in, it's going to be the fourth bullet point in my testimony of the study that I'm referencing. But increased hospitalization rates, so you see higher inpatient rates of cardiac patients and neurology patients in areas where there's an increased density of well pads.
Ms. Dagley, in the field of public health research, are short-term and long-term health effects studied differently?
So again, this field of inquiry into fracking is a relatively new field. Fracking operations have increased greatly over the past couple of years, and there's about a database of about 1,300 studies looking at these operations, and a fourth of them have only been done in the past year. So it's a lot. It's a new field. There's a lot more studies coming out, and this early on, you're not going to see the long-term health effects that we're talking about. You need 10 plus years for these larger epidemiologic studies to really see long-term health impacts from these operations.
Ms. Dagley, and you reviewed the METIS application materials, and you mentioned some other materials that you reviewed, including the maps. Did you collect any other information about the neighborhoods surrounding the METIS site?
Yeah, so I looked at the map and talked to some residents and called some of these schools to sort of get an idea of population. And looking at the map that you should have here in the testimony, I believe the proposed METIS well pad is the red little teardrop by the Harrison City Export Road. And the circle around it there is showing a 1 mile radius around it. Yeah.
Just for the record, that appears to be a PPT. That's titled PPT Well Site Radius Map.
Yes.
So within this 1 mile radius, you see there's a daycare center, which is, I believe, the Penn Pals Child Care Center. There's approximately 100 children enrolled in there from ages newborn to, I think, all the way up to 5th grade. So they're within the risk area that's identified in a lot of these studies of exposure to the well. And also worth noting that that area is overlapped by another proposed well pad site. So again, there's the compound effect where you can talk about pollution sources from one well site, but when somebody's within the 1 mile radius from various sites, they're going to be getting increased exposure. And as you've probably already heard from other people testifying, that children are some of the most vulnerable population. They breathe in more air per body weight than adults, therefore they're breathing in more air pollutants. And they also metabolize chemicals differently. And their organs and body systems are still developing, so they're just a much higher risk population.
And Ms. Dagley, based on this site-specific info for the METIS well site and the METIS well site and your review of the public health research, what do you conclude about the health impacts of this particular well?
I think there is, the precautionary principle definitely applies here. There is scientific plausibility that there is going to be a negative health impact to the people living within a certain radius of these well sites. And again, we need the larger epidemiologic studies, but we don't want our children and our grandchildren to be the test subjects for that. So on the basis of public health and and what I know about public health from these, in my review of these studies, I believe that it would be in best interest not to move forward with this well pad in favor of public health.
Thank you, Ms. Heck.
Ms. Condit?
You obtained your BS in nursing in 2012.
That's correct.
How long have you been the medical advocacy coordinator for the Western Pennsylvania Physicians for Social Responsibility?
About a year. I had that same position, but it was housed at the Environmental Health Project.
You were a medical advocacy coordinator for the Southwest Environmental Health Project simultaneously with or prior to being in that position for Physicians for Social Responsibility?
Prior to, it was the same position. It's just for 1 year. It was housed through EHP and is now through PSR for the past year.
And so when you say housed through, does that translate into initially Southwest Environmental Health Project paid you for that work, and now Physicians for Social Responsibility pay you for that work?
Sort of. It's the same grant. It was just the organization that was overseeing it.
You're not a toxicologist or an epidemiologist, correct?
That's correct.
You do not have a degree in public health?
That's correct.
You're not an expert on oil and gas development?
I think it would depend on what you mean by expert. I've extensively studied it, but I don't know how you define expert.
When you say that you've extensively studied it, you've read articles about oil and gas development?
I wouldn't say articles, I'd say research studies.
You consider yourself a fractivist, correct?
I don't want to say correct to that because I'm not sure how that term is defined.
Well, you were called that in an article in the Tribune, correct? Do you recall that article? And I will show you what I'm referencing here. It's an article in Trib Live called "Western Pennsylvania Residents Find Various Ways to Show Their Love of Country." And on the last page it says, "Dagley, 28 of the Strip District, is a fractivist," that's in quotes. "Someone who is against hydraulic fracturing, a method of drilling for natural gas. She has traveled to Washington, D.C., where she lobbied to stop or better regulate the gas extraction practice." Is that correct?
Correct, those are not my words, but if that is their definition of fractivist, I agree.
Now, Dr. Sue was here testifying in connection with the Gaia well pad, and his testimony has been stipulated to also apply in Metis. Have you been informed of that?
I have.
And he is the executive director of the Philadelphia chapter of Physicians for Social Responsibility, which is the organization for which you work at least part-time.
That is correct.
That organization, as Dr. Seuss testified, is devoted to major threats to public health, including climate change.
Was that a question?
Yes. Yes.
What was the question?
And the Physicians for Social Responsibility, for whom you work, is devoted to major threats to public health, including climate change. That was how Dr. Sue described one of the organization's goals. Do you agree?
Yeah, I agree.
And they want to ban fracking and build a fossil-free world. Again, Dr. Sue agreed with that. Do you?
I agree.
And I showed Dr. Sue, and I can show you too if you need to see it. It's already in the record. The board has it. That on Physicians for Social Responsibility's website, they state that they are working in multiple ways to, quote, give natural gas a black eye. Are you familiar with that statement?
I remember you stating that at Walter Sue's testimony.
Now, were you here for Dr. Sue's testimony?
I was here for part of it, yes.
And were you here when I showed him and the board a brochure, which I believe on which you were a co-author, that referred to fracking as a toxic cocktail?
Yeah, the toxic cocktail is referring to a group of chemicals that we believe negatively affects health through the studies that are referenced on that flyer. Toxic cocktail is just a catchphrase to get people's attention who are reading the handout.
When you put together that brochure as one of the two authors, can I assume that you didn't do a study or an evaluation of people's exposures or the doses of any chemicals that you believe they would be exposed to and what pathway would expose them from fracking?
I would say that we did a review of the literature that again is referenced on the back page of that brochure.
Well, let me ask you then very specifically, have you ever looked at any of the Pennsylvania DEP air monitoring data for the various air monitors that Pennsylvania DEP has placed in areas of high oil and gas development for either VOCs or PM 2.5, NO2, ozone?
I have.
And so you know from that then that they have found no exceedances of VOCs, of PM 2.5, of ozone, or of NO2 in the areas of high oil and gas development where they have those monitors, correct?
I've read that where they have those monitors, they are very insufficient readings. They will take one 24-hour average every 6 days at some of these sites. 24-hour average does not account for the spikes that are increasing, which those spikes can very significantly affect public health.
Do you believe that as an RN you are qualified to critique the toxicology and air exposure data of Dr. Chris Long?
I think that's a complicated question. I think I'm, as an RN and a BSN, who's, I've had a bachelor degree and I've critiqued a lot of research studies. I've been exposed to a lot of different types of areas of health expertise. Whether I'm a toxicologist or an air monitor expert, I am not, but I do think I am able of critical thinking and critiquing the studies I read.
Who has told you that the air monitoring data from the PADEP is inadequate? Where have you gotten that information that you just testified to?
That is my opinion from the information I got off of their website.
Have you looked at and analyzed the air data from the Allegheny County Health Department monitors that were placed nearby to two Allegheny County well pads, specifically the Deer Lakes and the Imperial Point well pads, while they were being developed?
Yes, and in fact, the Imperial Point well pad is the one where I said they took one 24-hour average every 6 days, and the other one, the Deer Lake one, they took like a 24-hour average like every once in a while. It was, it's not showing a regular, they should be doing 15-minute intervals, doing it constantly. To just kind of do it occasionally is not painting a full picture, and I don't think I need to be an air monitor specialist to recognize that.
Do you disagree with the statement of, do you know who Karen Hacker is, by the way?
Yes, I do.
She's the director of the Allegheny County Health Department, correct?
Yes.
And so would you then disagree with her statement that the air monitoring at those two locations showed nowhere near any excesses that would come close? Nosebleeds, headaches, dizziness, memory issues, cough, shortness of breath, wheeze, sleep loss, stress and anxiety, irritability and moodiness, nausea, abdominal pain, itching eyes, pain or dry eyes, fatigue, joint aches, rashes, lesions and blisters, palpitations, and chest pain.
I am aware that these are the self-reported symptoms that were told to EHP, and that these are also symptoms that certain chemicals, like VOCs that are released during various phases of fracking operations, can cause, separately. I am aware of those things, yes.
As a nurse, are you familiar with the proposition that the dose makes the poison, specifically that in order to determine what an impact's going to be from any chemical, you have to understand what the dose and the exposure is of an individual to that chemical?
I am aware of that, but we're talking about individual chemicals, and also that dose exposure changes when multiple chemicals are introduced from multiple sites, and that different people have different reactions. Somebody can be exposed to the same amount of benzene, and one person can have benzene toxicity and the other person can't. Our bodies react differently. All of you here could smoke cigarettes for 50 years and only half of you could get lung cancer. Doesn't mean cigarettes aren't dangerous.
Is it your position then that any amount of any chemical, no matter how small, should be banned and no one should be able to be exposed to even the slightest amount of benzene or anything, because even the slightest whiff of anything any chemical could cause harm.
That is not my opinion, but when 84% of the studies of public health and fracking show that there is negative or potential for harm for health, I believe that that is enough information to use the precautionary principle.
So let's talk a little bit about that precautionary principle. Are you here asking that a zoning hearing board in a municipality exercise a precautionary principle and make a public health policy decision in advance of state and federal government and agencies and ban fracking in the township?
Yes, I am, because individuals can't go through their lives with the precautionary principle. That would keep us from doing anything. If we had PubMed pulled up on our phone every time we wanted to make the slightest decision, the precautionary principle applies to governing or other large decision-making entities to apply, because that way the rest of us don't have to worry about it. If you guys are looking out for the health of yourselves and your family and whoever else is living in this township, then yeah, that is your role to make that decision, so the rest of us know that the air we're breathing is safe to breathe.
In your report, you indicated that you would like to address some of the concerns that were raised during Dr. Sue's testimony. Do you recall saying that?
Mm-hmm.
Do you believe you have more expertise than Dr. Sue to address the concerns that were raised with his report and his testimony?
No, I don't believe I have more expertise, but I believe that there are things that were not addressed during his testimony that I would like to follow up with.
Have you taken a look at the Colorado Department of Public Health study that I introduced through Dr. Sue and that the board has a copy of? And we went over their conclusions based on all of the air sampling that's been done in Colorado and also their review of the same health studies that you've looked at.
I have looked at it. I don't recall the details of it at this moment.
Well, let's just take a real quick look.
That's unfair. Sorry, sir, please.
I have copies for the board if they'd like. I can also indicate, though, that it is part of the Dr. Sue record, which has been by stipulation also introduced in the Metis case. Would you like a copy now in any event?
I don't need a copy, thank you.
If I could ask you to turn to page little 2. It's entitled Screening Assessment of Potential Exposures and Health Effects. And this again is the assessment of potential public health effects from oil and gas operations in Colorado, dated February 21st, 2017. And you said you have reviewed this, you just don't recall it?
I have read this in the process of a lot of other studies, but yeah.
Well, let's just very quickly go over the...
I just note.
Sir, we've had very civil proceedings here. If you have another outburst, we're going to have to ask you to leave.
Yes, Your Honor.
She's been offered as an expert. It's fair game to cross her about reports that have to do with...
That's your assumption, Your Honor.
Okay, please, sir, would you step outside? If I can't have you be polite and respectful,
I am being polite, Your Honor.
Well, then you need to be
I said
quiet.
that's your assumption.
if you need to be quiet, please. Can I have your word? We can count on that?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you. Okay, there was an objection.
Yeah, thank you. Mr. Stringer, I would just object to the questioning on this Colorado public health study, or sorry, the potential health effects from operations in Colorado. I think this testimony would be repetitive and unnecessary, and that Dr. Sue has already testified to this line of questioning.
Well, and I think the witness testified that she doesn't have an independent recollection of the study, that she read it, and it almost sounds in passing, so I'm not sure that it's proper cross-examination at this point.
That's fine, Your Honor. Dr. Sue's testimony and the exhibit will speak for itself. I would just point out that, all of Ms. Dagley's testimony is repetitious of what Dr. Sue already testified to, so.
I think the board can make that decision on their own.
When you were doing your literature review, do you recall reviewing an article by Werner, which was a literature review of all of the existing health studies?
I don't recall that one specifically.
How about the Mastery study? Do you recall looking at that?
I do recall.
And you saw then that there was air monitoring done downwind of an oil and gas pad in Washington County, and that there were no exceedances of VOCs found during that study?
I recall that they again were doing 24 averages, which don't catch spikes. I recall that some of the testing was actually upwind. I recall that they admitted not having baseline data before this, and I also recall that they admitted to not having the funding to do the kind of study that they really should have done.
Well, you would recall that there were specifically two sampling locations.
Yes.
One was predominantly downwind and one predominantly upwind, correct?
Correct.
And the one that was predominantly downwind showed no exceedances of VOCs, correct?
Correct.
I have no further questions for you, thank you.
Anybody on the board have any questions? Any of the direct? Thank you.
I have a little bit of background in public health, but I've never heard this term precautionary principle before. And maybe it's a newer term, but can you explain it a little bit?
Yeah, so trying to think of a way to explain it differently. The precautionary principle, there's always going to be conflicting scientific studies. And the idea in public health is you want to look for trends. So if there's a trend suggesting a public health risk, it's better to put public health before inaction. I'm trying to think of another way to phrase this. Is there a different way you could phrase the question for me to answer it differently? Like, it's just something like when you're reviewing scientific literature, you're going to see studies
There
that.
has to be boundaries on that, because you can find something wrong with almost everything.
That's true, but you can see trends within studies. You also have to weigh the risk of what is risk-benefit, which is another principle. For example, there are some things that you can't avoid, but you can avoid putting in a well pad when you know that there is, according to the review of literature, an 84% chance that there's going to be a potential for health harm, and that's where the precautionary principle would apply. We have historically, as a country, been really terrible applying the precautionary principle and have done it way too late. And we are using humans as test subjects, like time and time again. Like later down the road, we discover this thing is bad. So the precautionary principle is suggesting we halt this action before we wait to find everyone has cancer from this thing. That's the idea.
After Dr. Sue's testimony, I read an article in the paper which talked about kind of the same effects from fracking, the low birth weights of pregnant women, but this was associated with something completely different. I think it was they lived in areas where there was, major roads and a lot of truck traffic, etc. So how would you apply the precautionary principle to something like that?
Well, in that case, an action has already been taken. Like there's already that major roadway that people live near. I mean, again, that would be where you would put out a public health recommendation to not build like housing developments or put major roadways through heavily populated areas. That would be one way you could apply it. But I mean, that study makes sense because the same reason that they were probably having low birth weights was exposure to air pollution and VOCs, which is the same kind of thing they're concerned about in oil and gas operations.
Anyone else? Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much.
At this time, Protect PT would like to call Dr. Lawrence here.
Council, Dr. Pierre was accepted by the board as an expert in, I believe, analytical chemistry at the Gaia hearing. Is that what we're looking at?
I think we might have phrased it industrial chemistry.
Industrial.
Correct.
You know, do you anticipate any more, do you, or can we just stipulate?
I don't, Your Honor, and as I understand it, Mr. Ear's testimony from the Gaia proceeding has by stipulation been admitted in this proceeding, so I would just ask that we not repeat any of that here.
Okay, that's fair.
All right, thank you. So,
Mr. Hamilton, before you proceed, I need to acknowledge that Larry and I worked together for close to 25 years as on the Power Laboratory, the Westinghouse, or Bechtel Marine Propulsion Corporation. But given that, I could review Larry's testimony with unbiased view. I believe you would. Thank you.
so Dr. Ear, since stipulated to your qualifications, did you prepare an expert report for this METIS hearing?
Yes, sir.
And that expert report I'll represent was included in the binders that just been presented to the board and to the council.
For the record, we're going to mark that as Protect PT, Exhibit B.
Dr. Ear, what materials did you review in advance of this hearing tonight?
I looked at the light modeling, the sound modeling, the hydrogeologic report, the application to the board, looked at the whole package.
You also reviewed the references that you note in your report.
Yes, sir, I did.
And did you also review transcripts of testimony that had been included in the Gaia hearing previously?
Yes, sir, I did.
And based on your review of those application materials and for the METIS and the Gaia hearing, and also those transcripts, are you aware of produced water being stored on the METIS site?
Yes, sir, I am aware that it's going to be on site.
Can you point us in those application materials, is there anywhere where that produced water is described?
Yes, but it's nebulous. They have on page 8 of the Morris Knoll September hydrological report, on Mr. Hazard's 12/14/17 testimony on page 91 of the zoning board. He referred to the produced water as salty and containing some of the simulation fluids. We can infer that the produced water will probably contain some ammonia, hydrochloric acid, ethylene glycol, and methanol.
Dr. How do we infer that? Where is that described in your METIS application materials?
We would look at pages 3 and 4 of the air dispersion modeling and page 9 of the February 2018 hydrogeologic report.
And those chemicals that you described, those reports indicate that they would be in that produced water? Is that your understanding?
They would shoot them down into the ground, and some of that will come up with the produced water.
And Dr. Ear, what can you tell us about those individual chemicals in their properties?
Ethylene glycol is very poisonous. It blows out your kidneys. Methanol is toxic.
Your Honor, I'm sorry. To the extent that Mr. Gere is going to talk about health effects from chemicals, I would object. To the extent he's going to talk about chemicals as a chemist, then I don't know.
Give a response.
Right.
So I'm not sure how we distinguish between Dr. Gear's experience with the chemical properties of something and the health effects of that. I don't think he's going to testify related to any health research, but only
lay a foundation about his experience as an industrial chemist and how that experience has given him the information to have a knowledge of health effects of certain chemicals.
And I would just note for clarification of my objection, my objection really was going to I believe the testimony that it will blow out your kidneys. That was the genesis of my objection in terms of...
I understand that, but I think the board can give whatever weight they feel is appropriate to the testimony given and the characterization of that testimony. So that objection.
Thank you. Dr. Ear, in your experience as a chemist, how do you research certain chemicals?
We learn about this in school. I look at SACs, read SDS sheets, and I try to keep up on these chemicals.
What's SACs and SDS sheets?
Safety data sheets. We used to call them material safety data sheets. And SACs is an industrial hygiene book on hazardous chemicals. Bill, you might still have one at your desk at home.
Dr. Ear, did you include some of those SDS sheets as an appendix to your report?
Yes, they are.
Okay. And is that reviewing those SDS sheets, is that something that you would typically do in your work as a chemist?
Yes, we do. I always try to be up on the health and safety for the people that work with me. So I look into it, plus being on the hazmat team, I need to be up on things. I have to know what those chemicals are going to do to people.
Okay, so for the health and safety reasons around your workplace, you keep up to date on those things?
Yes, sir. And I'll never say anything that isn't general knowledge. These aren't anything you hear from me isn't any new theory of mine.
Okay, but it's based on your expert review of those SDS sheets and your knowledge that you've gained through your many years as a chemist?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Dr. Ear, you were in the process of describing that list of chemicals for us. Could you start that?
We started with ethylene glycol.
Ethylene glycol
Causes kidney issues.
Yes.
So what's next?
Right. There was methanol. We talked about it being, it's toxic and it's very flammable. You have to really watch how you store methanol. We talked hydrochloric acid. It's very corrosive. It eats through steel quite easily. We use it to dissolve metals. There's ammonia that has a very strong odor. It's poisonous. It gets in your eyes. It can saponify your eyes and make you turn blind. We got it.
And Dr. Ear, in preparing the report, are you able, I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. Dr. Ear, in your review of these specific chemicals and the application materials, are you able to make any determination about the properties of the produced water?
I like what Mr. Hazard said. He said it was toxic. I believe it's toxic because it'll, have, the brine that comes up will be loaded with salts. There'll be minerals in it. be some radon in it, uranium, radium, sometimes there's arsenic, and there'll be some of these stimulation fluids like ethylene glycol, methanol, ammonia. It's biocide, so it will be a toxic brew it comes out.
How are you defining toxic?
I define toxic as something that is harmful or lethal to human life, flora, or fauna.
And is that a definition that you would use in the normal course of your work as a chemist?
Yes, sir.
Dr. Ear, did you also review the testimony from Mr. Hazard regarding the procedures for radioactive waste handling?
Yes, I did.
And Dr. Ear, do you have any background in handling radioactive materials?
Yes, sir. I was a radiation worker at one time. I've analyzed radioactive materials. I've taken the Bettis Reactor Engineering School nuclear physics course, and I got a name in it. I don't mention that to brag, but just to say I finished the course. Many people say they take a course and they maybe go to a few classes, but I did finish it. And I've analyzed uranium, done isotopic analysis. I've helped our laboratory find vendors to do specialty isotope analysis for us. I also developed a method to determine potassium in waters so that there's corrections to be made for the beta activity.
Dr. Ear, based on your experience and your review of Mr. Hazard's testimony, what opinion do you have on those procedures that he identified? And
Well, Mr. Hazard talked of using a Geiger counter at the 12-14-17 zoning board hearing on page 88. Ms. Hoffman talked about procedures this evening, and also on page 19 of the 111-18 zoning board report. I really don't know how they're going to make their measurements. They talk about a Geiger counter. I have extreme concerns about the use of a Geiger counter. I think it will be useful for a lot of things, but what I'm really worried about is the alpha activity it could be in that produced water. Things like the radium, uranium, and polonium you can have in there, and radon can be in those waters. And if you hold a Geiger counter up to the container, you're not going to get any measurements. You really have to send the waters out and they evaporate it down, and they use a gas proportional counter to determine. So I think it's very important for the energy industry to really take this serious and really look at those waters carefully to make sure they know what isotopes and things are present. We're having problems with our rivers. There's increases in radioactivity being found in our river waters, and it's postulated because of some of the waste that's being put into the river water. It's not being processed right.
Your Honor, I'm sorry, I would just object to that last statement about the rivers. It was speculation and not relevant in any way to what we're here about tonight.
I'm going to say that we should disregard that testimony. It goes beyond the scope of his expertise.
Dr. Ear, in your review of these materials, and based on your experience working with chemistry, were there any chemicals that you identified that could produce air emissions if not properly contained?
Right. You'd have to worry about the ammonia. You'd have to worry about the methanol. You'd have to worry about the HCl. It's a big worry. And you'd also have to worry about hydrogen sulfide emissions.
And based on your knowledge of chemistry, why would hydrogen sulfide emissions be expected at the site?
The Huntley and Huntley folks talked about the hydrogen sulfide monitors. When petroleum and gas are formed by the decomposition of plant and animal life. And with that decomposition, you get some hydrogen sulfide formation. And the various sites in the ground will have varying amounts of hydrogen sulfide. Some wells will be very little, others will be quite a bit. The town of Versailles is having problems with hydrogen sulfide.
Thank you, Dr. Garrett. And from your review of the application materials, your review of the transcripts from the previous hearing, has company evaluated potential emissions of hydrogen sulfide from the Menace well site?
Only to say that they will have monitors for the hydrogen sulfide. I haven't seen anything on, what emission expectations they have.
Thank you very much.
Ms. Conda?
You're familiar that the risk to humans or animals or even vegetation of any particular chemical is based upon the receptor's exposure or the dose of exposure to that chemical, correct?
I'm aware of that.
Ethylene glycol is essentially antifreeze, or what's the main component of antifreeze.
Yes, it is.
And the salts, the minerals, and the radon, and the arsenic that you talked about being concerned about being in produced water, those are all naturally occurring elements in the earth?
They are, and they get concentrated in the brine of those produced waters, and you bring them back up to the surface.
And then that produced water goes into a storage tank and eventually gets hauled away from the site. Is that your understanding?
That is correct.
I know that it was just produced here this evening, but while you were in the audience, did you have an opportunity to take a look at the radiation monitoring action plan that Ms. Hoffman testified has been adopted by the PADEP in connection with their well sites?
No, ma'am, I have not. Are they going to make alpha measurements and special measurements on that produced water? I didn't see that.
Are you familiar that the gas in this particular area in this township is dry gas?
Yes, I am.
And the testimony you've given tonight about your various concerns, would that apply to any unconventional well site?
I think it would apply to any conventional well site, unconventional well site. It all depends on what's in that well, what's going to come out of that ground. You just don't know.
Thank you, sir.
Board have any questions for Dr. Garrett? Thank you, Doctor. Anything else tonight, Ryan? It's about 9:15, so if there's, my understanding was we were going to do your two experts and then, of course, it's the pleasure of the board.
I'm happy to accommodate the board's decision. We do have, if Patricia Wendell is still here, we do have one last witness that can testify, or we can save that for next week.
Patricia Wendell. Well, just a second, Ms. Wendell. Is this lay witness?
This would be a lay witness. We do not have any other expert witnesses.
It's quarter after 9.
Well, I'll open up if anyone would like to make a motion on the board to continue hearing or make a motion to adjourn for tonight and hold all until next.
If I could, our primary concern is that we actually get finished next time, and you're going to have one other variance hearing. Mr. Garlett's on cross. Mr. Donaldson will be back. Plus you have public comment. So if there's anybody here tonight that's willing, able to testify tonight, lay witness or otherwise, given that it's 9:15 right now, we would ask that any witnesses who are available tonight testify so that there's more of a chance that we can conclude the hearing next week.
I would make that motion for the board that we hear the one resident.
All in favor of the motion? Any opposed? Ms. Wendell?
Please raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give here today in this matter is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do.
Could you please just state and spell your name for the record?
My name is Patricia Wendell, W-E-N-D-E-L-L. I go by Tricia sometimes.
Ms. Wendell, what's your address?
3006 Augusta, A-U-G-U-S-T-A Lane. And it's Jeanette, 15644.
It's a Penn Township property.
Yes, it is.
Ms. Wendell, you actually testified previously in the diet hearing, is that correct?
I did.
And I believe we stipulated that Ms. Wendell's testimony from that hearing would be included in this hearing, just for you to know. So we're not going to repeat all of that, but could you tell us just briefly, approximately, how far you live from the proposed Metis well site?
It's half a mile.
And Ms. Wendell, are you aware of the Huntley and Company Poseidon well site?
Unfortunately, yes.
And approximately how far do you live from that Poseidon well site?
I think it's about a mile as the crow flies.
And Ms. Wendell, are you aware that the Poseidon well site construction has already started?
I have. I watched the pad being built. I watched the first tower, which I'm sorry, I don't know what the first little tower is called, and then the big rig was up with the red lights going back and forth from my house to Route 22 down School Road South. You could see it very clearly, day and night. At night, when they were doing the drilling, the lights were very bright, and as I said before, if it wasn't for the finally building of the clubhouse on the Blackthorn property, I would have had a direct sight to the well pad. If I walked on the cart path, I could see the actual pad itself.
Ms. Wendell, how did that impact you, your proximity to that Poseidon well pad?
Well, it wasn't something that I expected when we purchased our home 12 years ago, over 12 years ago. And it's not a very pretty site to look at. As I said before, in purchasing in Blackthorn, I did not realize that I was going to be sandwiched between all 11 of the proposed well pads, 6 to one side, 5 to the other side. And the Metis well will be, I'm positive, within the sight of when I look out my kitchen window every single day.
Ms. Wendell, if that Metis well site is visible from your window, how will that impact you? Do you expect it to impact you?
It's not going to make me very happy. It's not going to be something that I want to look at. It's not something that I expected to look at in purchasing my home.
Ms. Wendell, was noise a problem at the Poseidon well site?
When there were public hearings, Mr. Sweeney told me that I was not allowed to speak because I lived too far away from the Poseidon pad. But when the drilling actually started, it was a constant motor noise that you could hear. And yes, it started before the holidays, and finished up, I believe, was it the middle of February, when the noise stopped. But I could hear it. Of course, windows were closed, it was winter. One warm evening, I opened the bedroom window because I said, I shouldn't be able to hear this. And I could. I could hear it inside my house. I could hear it much louder with the window open, of course. On my patio with the slider open, yes.
Ms. Wendell, do you expect similar impacts from the Metis well site?
I don't see how I could not hear it when I could hear it when it was a mile away. If this is closer, I'm certain I'm going to hear it, as well as all the neighbors in my Black Fork community. Unfortunately, ones who have spoken to me commented on the lights, commented on the noise as well.
Thank you very much.
Do you have any questions for Ms. Wendell?
Just one or two questions for you. The circumstances you indicated you observed as it related to the Poseidon well pad, did you ever contact any representative of Huntley and Huntley to express your concerns or complaints about what you observed?
I did. I contacted Bill Roberts, and he contacted Mr. Burke, and Mr. Burke emailed me back, letting me know that they were drilling there, and that they were drilling the first well.
Thank you.
May I add something?
Sure.
In listening to Laura speak this evening, she was talking about precautionary principle, and what struck me as better safe than sorry. It's the old adage. Also, in living where I do, and my front faces School Road South, with the additional home construction that's going on now, there have been certainly an increase in truck traffic. The truck traffic is very loud, and from what I understand, the Metis well and Guile well, they're going to be using Harrison City Export Road. And Mr. Mahelka, you had mentioned about living near a road. Well, with all of the construction, be it well pads or be it homes, we're losing the trees and the shrubs, which act as a type of absorption for the sound. Also, the emissions. If you live closer to the road, it's going to take a longer time for the emissions to dissipate in the air. Just something that I was thinking about when she was talking. And also more noise, just more truck traffic noise. Thank you.
No further questions.
Mr. Sweeney, we have no further witnesses this evening.
Motion to continue the case to the next hearing.
So moved.
All in favor? Evening closed for